Hello, folks, and welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. I'm your creepy puppeteer, Tommy. Welcome to another episode of New-Age Apologetics. My impetus for making this video specifically was the story of a New Age writer and former liberal Christian, Doreen Virtue, who recently renounced her views in favor of conservative Calvinism because, in part, she read Deuteronomy 18.
When I started reading the Bible, the whole Bible this time, I cherry-picked it through my life. And I got to Deuteronomy 18:10 verses, Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 through 12, where Moses is giving his final speech to the Israelites before they cross the Jordan River. And he's saying, don't be like the Canaanites. Don't do what they do. Don't sacrifice your children. Don't do fortune telling. Don't do divination. Don't do mediumship or sorcery.
Right.
Don't try to interpret omens and signs. And 90% of this list was things I was doing currently. And I looked at that, and then it got to the end of that passage, and it says all of these things, the people that do them, God considers an abomination.
Right.
And it collapsed me. It broke me, because all this time I thought, because I was helping people were telling me I was helping them, and I was using Christian terminology. I really thought in the New Age I was doing God's work. I used to, and I've repented for this, but I used to call myself God's secretary as I was channeling books. I thought I was taking dictation from God. I mean, in the New Age, you're so blind. And that's one of the reasons when you talk to a New Ager who's blind, they seem super defensive, because the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing.
Yeah.
And that was me. So when I've read Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12, finally, and I saw myself in that, I said, I'm an abomination to God. And I fell to my knees. I wept. I said to God, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know that I was a sinner. But reading that was my big wake up. And after that, I was just a mess.
Now, I find it implausible that Miss Virtue never read nor heard this verse before, but given that New Agers rarely try to defend their beliefs rationally, it's understandable that Miss Virtue had never heard nor read any sort of counter-interpretations to this verse before. That's why I think this series is so important. Now, spiritualists like myself, and if you remember back to episode 1 of this series, I define that as the position that spirits exist and can communicate with us, are not only criticized by the rational skeptics who think that we're all deluded or malevolent frauds, but by religious fundamentalists who accuse us of being Satanists. Inevitably, if you hold New Age or spiritualist beliefs, you'll have Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12 thrown at you. And since this is the United States and your accuser will probably be a Protestant, let's read that as follows in the King James Bible. Dramatic Bible reading in 3, 2, 1. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter of familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doth drive them out before thee. Now, in a point of full disclosure, I love the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is an endlessly gripping narrative of people coming to terms with how they understand themselves, their faith, and their place in the world over time. It's a blend of song, poetry, history, probably a dozen other genres, and its context and history is an endlessly fascinating rabbit hole as well. It's probably my third favorite work of literature behind Frankenstein and Moby Dick. My point is, I have a great amount of respect for the text, and I often find it deeply frustrating for religious believers to pull verses out of context and interpret them according to their own traditions. Now, the part of the Bible I've just quoted, Deuteronomy 18, is part of what's known as the Mosaic Torah. That is, the set of instructions that God gave to Moses and bound Mosaic Israel. There's no evidence that the Mosaic covenant and the Mosaic Torah was ever intended for Gentiles. So as a Gentile, it's reasonable to say, okay, fine, but that's only for Jews. But again, your interlocutor is probably a Christian, and they're a follower of Paul, and Paul believes that this covenant is binding on us. So rather than argue what is and what is not binding on Gentiles, I'll rather argue, for now, that the biblical meaning of these practices differ from contemporary spiritualist and New Age beliefs. For this video, I'm using an online Strong's Concordance like this one from Biblehub. Now, excluding the child sacrifice, the practices in this passage are, in order, and I'm almost certainly going to butcher the Hebrew, kesem, which is a general word for divination and is thought to be etymologically derived from the casting of lots. Anon, another word for divination, soothsaying. This word comes from the word for cloud. Nachash. This is the most general word for divination. It seems to just mean divination. Kashaf, which means witchcraft or sorcery. Chabar, which means to join together. Ba'al Ob, Lord of Ghosts. Yideoni, one who obtains information from spirits. Vedoresh Hemetim, a consulter of corpses. I'll divide these phrases into three categories: sorcery, divination, and communication with the dead. Sorcery first. Chabar, to join together, is never mentioned again in a supernatural context. It's usually mentioned like a group bound together by some kind of oath. So its meaning is lost to us. Kashaf, on the other hand, is mentioned 6 times in the Bible and is always condemned. Famously, Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Again in Malachi 3:5. But we only get 3 instances of actual sorcerers in the Old Testament. King Manasseh practices witchcraft in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Sorcerers are present in the court of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, and in the court of Pharaoh in Exodus 7. All of these sorcerers are in the courts of pagan kings, or in Manasseh's case, a Jewish king who adopted pagan practices. So there's a strong connection in the Old Testament between Kashaf and paganism. We see this especially strongly in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 2. But Manasseh did evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord has cast out before the children of Israel. We only get one actual instance of witchcraft in the entire Old Testament. In Exodus 7, you probably remember this story from Sunday school, Aaron casts down his staff before the Pharaoh and it turns into a serpent. The Pharaoh's own sorcerers cast down their staffs and they turn into serpents. And Aaron's serpent devours the serpent of the sorcerers. Now, it seems obvious that these sorcerers are probably priests of the Egyptian faith, and given the other connection between witchcraft and paganism, it seems that what the Bible means by witchcraft, kashaf, is calling on the power of gods who are not Yahweh. It's not a particular act that matters. I mean, you hear Yahweh and the Egyptian gods both do the same act, turning a staff into a serpent, but it's the source of the power. This is consistent with the Bible's many exhortations for exclusive Jewish worship of Yahweh. So are spiritualists who are monotheists capable of doing biblical witchcraft? It doesn't seem so. I'm going to turn now to the question of divination. The Bible makes a clear distinction between kosher and unkosher forms of divination. In the prologue of the Witch of Endor story, which we'll deal with in depth in just a moment, we are given a list of acceptable forms of divination. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by the Urim, nor by the prophets. So dreams, prophets, and the Urim and Thummim are acceptable forms of divination. The Urim and Thummim were divination devices, probably divination by casting lots. See 1 Samuel 14:41 and Leviticus 16:8. And this is odd, considering the kesem etymology as meaning divination by casting lots. Other forms of divination that seem to be forbidden by Deuteronomy 18 are permissible outside and before the establishment of Mosaic Israel. In Genesis 44, we find that Joseph, him of the many-colored coats fame, performed divination, nahash, by scrying in a silver goblet, and he's not condemned for doing so. Astrology, a popular whipping boy for anti-New Age, anti-occult Christian fundamentalists, is never condemned anywhere in the Bible. And when astrology is mentioned, it always takes the form of God's means of communicating. In Genesis 1:14 we read, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." And even in the New Testament we read that God uses astrology to reveal the birth of the Messiah. "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him." It might be that astrology was included in neither list, kosher or unkosher, because it was such a common part of life that it simply wasn't worth mentioning. Now, I know there are spiritualists and certainly New Agers who are interested in astrology and divination like tarot, but there's no scriptural or historical reason to think that divination is any more sinful than eating a bacon cheeseburger. In fact, for the pious believer, it may be that they're reconsecrating the Urim and Thummim in the forms of their tarot deck. But before I leave the topic of divination, I do want to take some time to thoroughly mock the theological argument made in opposition to divination, namely that divination attempts to know the future, which can be known only to God. Thus, attempting to know the future is playing God, and it's sinful. But if that were the case, is statistical regression a sin? What about physics? If I drop a weight from a height, I'm predicting where it's going to land and how long it's going to take to get there. So is physics sinful? I think perhaps the best example of this is meteorology. Is predicting the weather a sin, especially since one of the forbidden forms of divination refers to watching clouds, etymologically? There's a long speech that God gives to Job in Job 36 through 39, where God emphasizes his power over the weather, and how only God knows the nature of the weather. In trying to understand the weather, are we not treading on God's domain? And in an apocryphal book, Enoch, predicting the weather is one of the skills taught to humans by fallen angels. Why doesn't the Christian right protest the satanic weather channel? Alright, enough of mocking silly fundies. We all know what you're here for. Let's talk about the Witch of Endor. First things first, consulter of corpses, which I don't even want to attempt again in Hebrew, never comes up again in the Old Testament. The Yiddeoni, the obtainer of information from spirits, is never mentioned apart from the Baal Ob. This suggests that Yiddeoni is a synonym or alternative title for the Baal Ob. Now, in 1 Samuel 28, King Saul is going to war with the Philistines and is desperate for an omen, but God won't give him an omen through any of the kosher forms of divination just mentioned. So, desperate, Saul seeks out an unkosher divination. But unfortunately for him, Saul has spent much of his reign persecuting practitioners of unkosher divination and driving them out of Israel. So Saul sends agents out to find some. His agent finds a Baalat Ob, a lordess of spirits, living in Endor, a town in the Jezreel Valley in Galilee. Saul goes to her and, promising her immunity, asks her to summon the spirit of Samuel out of Sheol. She summons Samuel out of Sheol, and Samuel condemns Saul for disturbing his sleep, says that the reason the kosher forms of divination failed was because God already abandoned Saul, and he was going to lose the war. Saul dies later at the Battle of Gilboa. When the Baalat Ob calls the spirit of Saul, she says, "I have seen gods come forth out of the earth," which suggests what's going on here is that the spirits of the dead are being summoned to the world of the living from the world of the dead, which is to say necromancy. Spiritualist mediums generally perceive the spirits of the dead from within the world of the dead, without piercing the veil, as it were, which the prophets themselves seem to have had the ability to do. Prophecy given in Isaiah 14 contains a vision of what the dead are doing in Sheol. Hell, Sheol, from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised them up from their thrones, all the kings of the nations. I think we can even explain why necromancy is unkosher. Necromancy violates the prohibition against the corruption of the dead. Leviticus 19:31. Regard not them who have familiar spirits, Hideoni, neither seek after a wizard, Baalob, to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So there is an act of defilement in necromancy. 2 chapters later, Leviticus 21, we open with, there shall none be defiled for the dead among his people. The Bible prohibits necromancy, which is the calling of the spirits of the dead to earth, because it violates ritual corruption. Now, I know many Christians have a tradition that the spirits of the dead are actually demons, but there's a glaring problem with this tradition. The Hebrew word for demon is shed, a cognate and possible borrowing of the Akkadian word shedu, which is a kind of genius loci. I would love to do a video on Old Testament demonology someday. But for now, my point is, why does the text use the word for ghost, ob, when it could have just used the word for demon? It's almost like the author of the text knew the difference between a ghost and a demon and picked the right word accordingly. I mean, if it were true that, as some Christian fundamentalists believe, that ghosts don't exist and are all demons, wouldn't it have been helpful to mention that? Hilariously, while the Old Testament mentions people worshiping demons and forbids the practice, see Deuteronomy 32:17, Psalms 106:37, nowhere in the Old Testament is communicating with demons or even summoning them prohibited. So summoning ghosts, no. Summoning demons is perfectly fine with God so long as one doesn't worship them. So in conclusion, is spiritualism or the New Age witchcraft biblically defined? No. Is spiritualism necromancy biblically defined? No. Are the theological justifications fundamentalists offer for these prohibitions ridiculous? Yes, laughably so. Knowledge of the Bible is a powerful tool for anyone who holds beliefs that fundamentalists might view as heterodox, to put it politely, and we will surely come back to the Bible in future videos. For now, though, thanks for listening and take care.